Hey guys, welcome back to the Candlestick Kids Fantasy Football Podcast. I'm your host, Bobby Lamarco. Today I'm running solo, relaxing on the couch, a little Saturday vibes. Going to talk a little bit about another one of our How to Find Steals in our segment in your fantasy football drafts. Today we're talking about A.J. Dillon and the impacts that helped him over and exceed his ADP, positional ADP. We want to make sure everyone knows that you're subscribed to us across the board. Make sure you're checking us out on these videos on the Fantasy Focused YouTube channel. Make sure you're also following us on Instagram, Twitter. You can find me at Fantasy Football X Factor on Instagram, at Bobby Lamarco on Twitter, at Sky Gawasco, etc. So make sure you're following us across the board, providing a lot of other content outside of just YouTube. And if you guys do want to check out, we do have a weekly podcast that comes out on the podcast side, the Candlestick Kids. You can check us out across the board there as well. But before we dive into anything else, let's kind of give you just a high level of A.J. Dillon and what his season was like and what made him an actual value. So how to find steals in your fantasy football draft is kind of what the whole segment's been about this entire time. And today we're talking about A.J. Dillon. And before we even get into whether, the data, the information, here's the facts. Listen, A.J. Dillon played 17 games. So he ends up looking like a steal because he finishes as the RB23. His positional ADP was RB36. And overall, he was picked in the 8th round at pick 94 overall. However, his points per game was 34. So he still performed at his ADP, but it's really that overall finish that kind of made him a steal in the grand scheme of things. However, when you're breaking down A.J. Dillon, let's talk a little bit about his consistency before we break down his 2 seasons. It's pre-injury from Aaron Jones and post-injury Aaron Jones. And it's really kind of eye-opening the differences between those 2 seasons. First off, let's talk about his consistency of 2021. Now, A.J. Dillon was 24th in elite games. He had 2 elite games this season. He was 36th, though, RB1 finishes with only 4 of his 17 games were over 14 points. And he was also 37th in RB2 finishes. And that's 5 games. So he really, when you're breaking down how many times he was an RB2 this season, it really wasn't that impressive. RB2 in this metric is 11.7 points per game. That's what we use of FF Today stats, so shout out to them. But 5 of his 17 games were RB2. So really, A.J. Dillon wasn't overly impressive, but he was very consistent once Aaron Jones went down. So let's talk about this. This is the breakdown between the 2. And Aaron Jones, weeks 1 through 9, when he was rolling, A.J. Dillon was not that involved. He was only averaging 6.9 points per game in half-point PPR weeks 1 through 9. He averaged 10 touches over that time frame, 54 yards, only had 1 total touchdown. Then Aaron Jones gets hurt. And for the sake of this argument, I'm actually going to exclude the game he got hurt and the game right after that he missed, and week 18 when him and Aaron Rodgers didn't play and Dillon did get some action in the first half. So what that means is we're essentially looking at week 12 on and excluding that week 18 game, because I want to be fair. What was A.J. Dillon like with Aaron Jones once he got back in the lineup? So over that final 6-game stretch with A.J. Dillon and Aaron Jones in the games together after the Aaron Jones injury, he averaged 13.8 touches. So that's up from 10. He got about nearly 4 more touches a game. His yardage was roughly the same, right around 60 total yards, but he had 5 touchdowns. So he went from 1 touchdown in the first 9 weeks prior to the Aaron Jones injury to actually 5 touchdowns in 6 games with Aaron Jones when he was back in the lineup. That both bumped him up to 11.9 points per game in half-point PPR. That would have been RB22. That's not too bad. But when you dive into those games, he really had a much higher floor, but he only had 2 really big games, and he also only had 3 of his 6 games in double figures. So he was still pretty tough to trust. But 4 of his 6 games fell between 7 and 10 points in half-point PPR, and then he had 2 big games with Aaron Jones back in the lineup. So, looking at that outlook, it makes him a little bit tougher to trust. In any PPR, half PPR format, it's still most of that passing work is going to Aaron Jones. But where the biggest change happened, of course, those touchdowns, it isn't a surprise why it went from 5 and 6 games from previously 1 and 9 games. and it really becomes down to his red zone work. So A.J. Dillon, weeks 1 through 6, had 10 red zone carries, 0 touchdowns. Okay. Weeks 12 through 17, with Aaron Jones back in the lineup, 19 red zone carries, 3 touchdowns. So we see that his usage, even with Aaron Jones back in the lineup, he became the main ball carrier in the red zone. Over that 19 carries in the red zone of weeks 12 through 17, over that same span, Aaron Jones had 4 carries in the red zone. So A.J. Dillon is now the red zone back. More importantly, carries inside the 5. Weeks 1 through 9, Aaron Jones had 7 carries inside the 5 to only 1 for A.J. Dillon. That flipped to 6 for A.J. Dillon and only 1 for Aaron Jones, weeks 12 through 17. Now remember, weeks 12 through 17 is when Aaron Jones was actually in the lineup again. So they started giving A.J. Dillon the red zone work, which has really kind of pushed up his floor and also now gives him that touchdown upside because he's getting those red zone looks. Now, the other thing with A.J. Dillon is that this is only a very small sample size. So this is a sample size of weeks 12 through 17. Now, over the course of 16 games, 17 games, he's going to be a threat for double-digit touchdowns next season if he is that main goal line back in the Packers offense if Aaron Rodgers returns. So what's the outlook for 2022? Well, first off, he's early. We finally starting to get ADP. Thank God. So late February ADP from Fantasy Pros that combines a bunch of different sites, expert rankings, and stuff like that. Have him as a top 50 overall pick, RB24. Now, it's going to be tough because Aaron Jones is still going to be the lead back in this scenario. He still is getting more touches. He also gets more of the receiving work, even though A.J. Dillon has now carved out that red zone work. So remember, we just talked about in this role, he was about the RB22. So when you're drafting him in the 5th round at RB24, we could make an argument you're potentially drafting him at his ceiling. Now, Aaron Jones isn't going anywhere. So we know that. If Aaron Rodgers comes back, we also know that this offense is going to be in a lot of scoring positions. So I do think A.J. Dillon will have a lot of value. However, as your 5th round pick, remember the wide receivers that are going in this range. This is the thing. When we get to draft season, when you get to 50th overall, let's actually just pull it up right now. Let's see, based on the consensus right now, he's going ahead of James Conner, Darren Waller, Michael Carter, Brandon Cooks, Miles Sanders, Michael Pittman. Some interesting names overall, but like Hunter Renfrow, Terry McLaurin, Amari Cooper. So there's some notable wide receivers, even a Michael Thomas potentially. We'll see if he can bounce back. Dillon's going ahead of. So I don't know how much Dillon I'll be drafting at 50th overall, knowing that in this scenario, he's still going to be the 1B back, even though he's getting red zone work. Now, what we like to do is try to find who could be potentially the A.J. Dillon for 2022. Now, it is he was one of the highest graded PFF running backs in 2020. So 2021, he once again was one of the higher graded backs in PFF. So I wanted to take a look at some of the guys that could potentially do the same. First one comes is Ramondre Stevenson. Stevenson will probably get 1B work most of the season, but if Damian Harris gets hurt, there is a very likely scenario that you could see even when Harris returns, Stevenson becomes more involved and takes over that position. So Stevenson is someone that really comes to mind, in my opinion, that could take on an A.J. Dillon type season, especially with Harris getting dinged up over this year when he was a full-time workhorse. Darrell Henderson is another guy with Cam Akers back. A lot of people behind Cam Akers, and it looks like they used more of a bell cow this year. So maybe not Darrell Henderson, but he's someone that if Cam Akers gets hurt again, he could find himself back into this range as well. Gus Edwards is another big one. Of course, J.K. Dobbins is the lead guy, but this is another great scenario where when Gus Edwards and J.K. Dobbins played together 2 years ago, they were very close. Once they got rid of Mark Ingram, they were very close in points per game. So Gus Edwards could be someone that potentially could do something similar to A.J. Dillon in the second half of 2022, especially if Dobbins gets hurt or for whatever reason. Some minor ones that I thought about too, higher draft capital, because remember, A.J. Dillon had high draft capital too. Jamal Williams left the free agency, and then he got bigger work. So Zach Moss, I know that Devin Singletary really took on that role, but Zach Moss has high draft capital, so he could be someone that potentially takes on a bigger role. Next year in the second half, there's an injury, and then Trey Sermon. Of course, Elijah Mitchell, we're truthers here on this show, but at the same time, Trey Sermon could potentially be someone that, if he has that draft capital, he looks better in year 2. We could be looking, nipping at the heels of Elijah Mitchell. And if Mitchell gets hurt, Sermon could take over that role at some point. So that's really our breakdown, A.J. Dillon. Overall, it's really just the fact that he stayed healthy. He actually performed extremely well in the games without Aaron Jones. When you're literally diving into the numbers, it showed that down the second half of that season, they really started trusting A.J. Dillon, and it was his red zone work. So beware of him at pick 50th overall, RB24, but we do want to keep monitoring A.J. Dillon. This, once again, was how to find the steals in your fantasy football draft, reviewing all the steals from 2021 to see what common factors we could find for next season. I'm your host, Bobby LaMarco. This was the Candlestick Kids Fantasy Football Podcast on the Fantasy Focus YouTube channel. All our podcasts are brought to you by BetOnline AG and Believe Podcast Network. Thanks, everybody, for joining again. We'll be back soon with Elijah Mitchell coming up. Have a great day, guys.